Clark here with us. He is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Evansville. His background is he holds a BA in anthropology from the University of Oregon, a master's degree in international affairs from Florida State University, and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Missouri. His area of research focus is on Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, and looking at religion in Indonesia. He has a number of publications in various peer-reviewed journals, including Human Nature, Religion, Brain and Behavior, and Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences, among other journals. As well, he has a book chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Parenting. He did, prior to going to the University of Evansville, held a postdoc in human family and evolutionary demography at the University of New Mexico. And he teaches courses on the anthropology of religion, evolution of religion, cultures of Southeast Asia, evolution of human behavior, and cultural anthropology, among a variety of others. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Kyle Clark.
Thank you. There's lots more people than I was expecting to be lecturing to, so bear with me. I'll try to project to the back of the room from you to the back, but those of my students who are present will know that I don't have the most projecting voice, but I will try my best. This room isn't too big, so I should be okay. But that said, this is my first time on USI's campus, despite the fact that I work across town and actually live on the west side of Evansville, so I'm very happy to be here. I got the tour earlier. You guys have a very beautiful campus, and I'm happy to be here. All right. So as I like to start my lectures by letting the audience know what you signed up for the next hour or so. So I'm going to start by going over a little bit of background into what drove me into anthropology, why I ended up becoming an anthropologist in the first place. And then I'm going to transition to the background of my research in evolutionary anthropology as applied to human behavior, modern human behavior. I'm not going to be talking about kind of paleoanthropology and that stuff. Kind of a different subfield of evolutionary anthropology, which I'll explain. And then I'm going to continue with the background on giving some quick hitters on Iban culture, the people that I study. And then I'll define ancestor worship for you. I promised you a talk on ancestor worship. I will define what that is and talk about why defining it the way I do is important to my research. And then finally, I will describe, using that definition, describe Iban ancestor worship before moving on to the importance of ancestors, and finally, measuring the influence of ancestors. So we're kind of building up towards this last study here. And as you can kind of see, these first four parts are more kind of background information. And then these last three, I will give you some kind of quick hitters on some of the studies I've done in Indonesia. That said, I'm going more for breadth than I am for depth. So I'm just going to be kind of highlighting different parts of a few studies that I've done, some of which were mentioned in the introduction. All right, so every semester, I always teach at least one gen ed in every class. And I always begin, these big lectures, like lecture halls. I teach in lecture halls somewhat like this sometimes. I like to give a survey. It's usually more for me in terms of getting to know my students, what their majors are, what their background is, where they come from, typical things that I like to know about as an anthropologist of my students. And one of the questions I ask is essentially an ask me anything. What do you want to know about me? And the most common question I always get from students is always some variation of, why anthropology? Why did you major in anthropology? What drove you into anthropology? So even though you're not my students, I'm going to give you some background. But I'll tell the story that I always tell my students and what ended up driving me towards anthropology. So long story short, I started my academic career when I was an undergrad as a criminal justice major. Became unsatisfied with that, changed to an international affairs major. Decided I was also unsatisfied with that, so if you change majors again, I was right there with you when I was an undergrad. So as kind of this free agent, I wanted to pick very carefully for this third round, right? I wanted to really commit to something, and decided I'm not going to think about what I can do with my degree after I graduate. I'm going to pick whatever major helps me best answer this question. So I was interested in what the meaning of life is. College is a great time to just take a lot of random courses. Again, I wasn't thinking about what I can do with the degree after. I was thinking about what kind of classes are going to be most interesting to me. And I was really interested in answering this question at the time as a young college student. Maybe you're all thinking the same, or maybe I was just weird. But I considered majoring in some of the obvious choices: philosophy, religion, even thought about history. Right? Studying the historical developments through time might give me some insight into answering this question. And at that same time, I took a gen ed course in cultural anthropology, an introductory course, and decided, with its focus on diversity of human experience, that maybe I could look at those diverse perspectives and how different cultures might answer this question, and maybe I can kind of find some common themes that help me ultimately answer this question. So I decided after about halfway through that semester into cultural anthropology that I was going to change my major to anthropology and really dive in to the subject to help me answer this question. So as I started taking more courses in anthropology, I started learning about these various perspectives. And again, one of the things that kind of drove me to continue with anthropology was the idea of explaining human behavior, generally speaking. Excuse me. All right, the allergies are getting my throat a little bit, so I'll try to power through it. So I was learning about all these different perspectives, right? The functionalism of Malinowski, the structuralism of Levi-Strauss, the interpretive approach of Victor Turner, Clifford Geertz. So I was trying to compare these different perspectives because, again, I was really interested in the ultimate meaning of life, explaining why humans behave the way they do, and I thought that could help me answer the ultimate meaning of life. But I began to grow, the more I read about these researchers and their perspectives, I began to grow unsatisfied. I was dissatisfied with their theories, mainly because I didn't think they were testable. How do I know if functionalism is really all that different than the interpretive approach, or structuralism, or cultural materialism, et cetera, right? These are just some of the highlights. There's obviously many more. But that said, I wanted something that was a bit more testable, right? These were a little too fluffy for my taste. I didn't think you could really compare them to actually get ultimate explanation of human behavior. So after really diving into my cultural courses, of course, as any good undergraduate anthropology program, I was forced to take some biological anthropology courses. So while I was at the University of Oregon, I took an introduction to biological anthropology class and kind of learned about human evolution, some paleoanthropology and primatology, getting a bit more perspective on the human experience from an evolutionary perspective. So this intrigued me initially, but things didn't really click. So Oregon's on a quarter system, so I took biological in the winter, and then that spring, kind of building off of that, I took a class with this guy here, Lawrence Young, or Larry as he's known, in a class called Human Life History, and that explicitly links evolutionary theory to ultimate explanations of human behavior. Right? So if you want to know why humans behave the way they do, you can use the theory of evolution to better understand that. So this I liked because it actually made testable predictions, unlike some of the other approaches, again, that I was growing dissatisfied with. So again, about halfway through this semester, again, I was kind of hooked on this approach. So I was an anthropologist. Not only that, I was really going to dive headfirst into understanding human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So with that said, I want to give you some background on the ultimate approach that I ended up taking for the rest of my anthropological career, and still do to this day. So as a very simplistic way of putting it, evolutionary anthropology, at least as applied to modern human behavior, is at the crux of biological anthropology and cultural anthropology. So we take a lot of the methodology and underlying theory from biological anthropology, while also combining some of the methodology like field work and observations of cultural anthropology. Evolutionary anthropology can essentially be broken into kind of two primary subfields within, again, the study of modern human behavior. There's what I'm more trained in is the subfield of human behavioral ecology, which essentially predicts that humans should behave in ways that optimize their reproductive success. Whether or not that's consciously or not is irrelevant. Right? Natural selection will favor behaviors that ultimately improve people's reproductive success, whether or not they're consciously seeking those behaviors out or not. And then cultural evolution focuses more on kind of treating culture as these kind of units of culture, like certain behaviors as units of culture, and how they're transmitted from generation to generation and or horizontally between friend groups, things like that. So it's not about behavior per se, it has behavioral consequences, but it's more focused on kind of treating culture as a unit of analysis, whereas human behavioral ecology are really focused on the actual behavioral and especially reproductive outcomes of specific behaviors. So to give you an example, this is more from a human behavioral ecological approach. We usually borrow our broader theories from evolutionary biology. As I mentioned, we kind of borrow from evolutionary biology and evolutionary anthropology. So parent-offspring conflict is a theoretical perspective in evolutionary biology, which acknowledges that human parents, well, not just human, parents and their offspring are vary genetically. They do not overlap genetically 100%, usually in mammals. It's 50% on average. You get 50% of your genes from the mother's side and 50% of your genes from the father's side. Therefore, there's going to be inherent conflict in those non-overlaps, where the genes don't overlap, between the reproductive interests of the parents and the reproductive interests of their offspring. So human behavioral ecologists are interested in asking these kinds of questions and how this kind of manifests, in what ways these parent-offspring conflict manifests in humans, I should say. So this has produced an array of studies. I'm not going to summarize them here, all by some different researchers. This typically manifests, as you can probably guess, in kind of mate choices and or marriage choices. Long story short, very often, even cross-culturally, parents want their children to marry partners that their children wouldn't pick for themselves and vice versa. So there's been many studies cross-culturally about parent-offspring conflict and kind of marriage and mate choices. And even, again, kind of an interesting study about thinking about infant song, right? Why do parents sing to their infants? Kind of through the lens of parent-offspring conflict. This is one of the reasons I really like evolutionary theory, is again, it gives you a kind of solid quantitative analysis analyzing kind of various human behaviors. Parent-offspring conflict being just a small subset. So one thing I want to leave you with before I leave this parent-offspring conflict part is the idea that parents are expected to mold their offspring against its better interests, which is a central feature of parent-offspring conflict. The idea is that parents should be in a position to more or less win the evolutionary battle in molding their offspring, especially at an earlier age. Obviously, that gap kind of closes as offspring get older. So I'm going to come back to that, so I want you to keep that in the back of your minds. But now I'm going to move on to a brief cultural description of Iban. All right, so Iban folks are a Dayak people, which I'll get here in a second, from the island of Borneo. So we're in greater Southeast Asia. Borneo is the third largest island in the world, hard to miss, in the island part of Southeast Asia. And then within the island of Borneo, this actually showed up better than I thought it would. You can see this kind of colored part right here is a seasonal lake. So that's Batang Lipar is kind of this general area on the eastern side of this lake here. And this is generally the area where I work. So not too far from the Malaysian border, as you can see. I did make one trip during my 10 months in Southeast Asia, across the border in Malaysia. Most Iban actually live in Malaysia. There's kind of a small scattering of longhouses communities in the Indonesian side of the border. So I'm kind of a researcher who studies Iban outside of their kind of quote-unquote bigger, more represented country. All right, so as any good cultural anthropology class or lecture should cover, Iban are a Dayak people of Borneo, which essentially means that they're an indigenous group. Dayak's a broader label for essentially the non-Muslims. There's the Malay Muslims, and there's the Dayak Christians in kind of modern parlance in Indonesia and Malaysia. So they're a Dayak group, so they've been Christianized. They're known for having these big longhouses. They practice longhouse domicile, and they're, like many traditional small-scale societies, are traditionally small-scale horticulturalists practicing swidden or slash-and-burn horticulture. And obviously their main staple crop is rice, being Southeast Asians. So as I'll get to a more description of their religion, but just some quick hitters of their kinship system and how it relates to religion. They practice a bilateral kinship system, tracing ancestry through both the mother's line and the father's line simultaneously. Inheritance typically follows residence in households. So whether it's the firstborn offspring, the lastborn offspring, or offspring in the middle, typically one offspring will remain in the household and care for their parents in their old age, and they inherit that household and all its possessions. Typically the rice fields being kind of big primary possessions. They are traditionally have a system of ancestor worship, which I'll get to here in a second, which has not been always described as such, but I will argue. They have a fairly robust system of ancestor worship. But in more recent times, it's been syncretized with more recently introduced Christianity. And as you can probably guess, as is typical with Southeast Asia, a lot of the traditional rituals revolve around the rice cycle, right? Ensuring plentiful harvests, trying to ensure that the planting goes well, things like that. There's a lot of kind of mini rituals that are involved with the rice cycle. Pictured here is this kind of catering offering to the ancestors, and or now they would say the Christian God as well. Again, these kind of traditional forms of worship centered around, in this case, the planting season, right? They just planted their rice. They want to ensure that it grows healthily throughout the year. So they do these kind of smaller rituals as offerings. All right, so specifically, the community I worked in was a smaller longhouse community. Consisted of about 84 individuals, which varied throughout the year due to labor migration, typically to Malaysia. A lot of folks, specifically the kind of middle-aged and younger to middle-aged men, would go work in plantations or factories on the Malaysian side of the border and then send remittances back. So they, again, this number kind of fluctuates, but 55 adults was kind of the focus of my research, which again kind of fluctuated depending on the time of the year. Spread throughout 21 households, and they were fairly market integrated, which is why a lot of these younger and middle-aged men were seeking employment in Malaysia and beyond, was because they could buy things in the market, and a big motivation was also to send their children to schools in the cities as well. So kind of with more market integration, education and promoting education in their children is becoming more important. Thus, they need income to pay for their schooling and or buy things, since they're working and not working in the rice fields as much. They have to buy the rice in the market instead. So kind of a culture in transition, as a lot of these small-scale societies are. And so picture here, again, you can kind of see the size of this longhouse here. This is the interior room of the ruai, just kind of cut off down here. But each apartment, you can kind of see these doors, hopefully, is a separate household, but they're largely connected by, again, this bigger structure, which we call the longhouse. Nowadays, the more market-integrated and wealthier families will actually build separate single-family households outside of the community, but traditionally they would all kind of build their households right next to each other as a continuous longhouse. So again, here's what a longhouse looks like from the exterior, just to give you an idea. It's almost always raised at least a couple feet. This is only raised about 6 feet. Sometimes they can be raised up to like 20 feet. And in part because they would usually build these near rivers, so seasonal flooding sometimes. They wanted it to be raised. And then they're also traditionally headhunters, so part of it was just protection, right? If it's raised, it's going to be harder to access in the middle of the night for a sneak attack or something like that. All right, so I promised you a lecture on ancestor worship. Let's talk about it. So I want to start by offering this, what I would consider a very general definition of ancestor worship. Many anthropologists in the anthropological literature would define ancestor worship with something like this. Maurice Bloch was known for studying ancestor worship in Madagascar and Africa to some extent. But I have two primary concerns with this definition that I want to walk you through. First, it's this idea that beliefs are central to ancestor worship. I'm not going to harp on this too much in this talk. That's a whole other lecture in itself. But I push back against the idea that religion is inherently about belief. I think it's about something else, which again, I'll get here to in a second. So more importantly for this talk, I think that focusing on ancestor worship as only dead ancestors influencing the living, the behavior of the living, is only unidirectional, right? It's very one-sided. Dead ancestors being claimed to influence human behavior. But I think it could also go the other way as well. And I think that's important in any analysis of ancestor worship. Therefore, I favor the Stedman and Palmer definition instead, defining ancestor worship as the communicated acceptance of the claim that dead ancestors can influence and be influenced by their living descendants. So I'm replacing beliefs with a system of communication, in this case a specific kind of communication, that about dead ancestors being able to influence their living descendants, and or living descendants being able to influence their dead ancestors. So this could manifest as something like someone saying, stop doing what you're doing, you're going to make the ancestors angry. Right? So implicit in that such a statement is the idea that human behavior will make the ancestors angry, thus influencing their mood. So it's bidirectional as opposed to just unidirectional, which I think is important in having a more robust analysis of ancestor worship. So with that said, let's dive in to some of my analyses. Well, this hopefully will become a little bit more clear of why I think defining ancestor worship the way I do is very important. Because part of my dissertation, I did what's called an alternative dissertation, to give a brief side note, at the University of Missouri, where because evolutionary anthropology is not a book field, it's a paper field, I could publish papers and kind of combine those. So my dissertation really wasn't a cohesive study per se. It was kind of these little mini studies that had an overarching theme, part of which was to describe why ancestor worship is so common cross-culturally, using my Iban data, and hopefully being able to generalize from that data. So with that said, I was interested again in looking at the Iban system of ancestor worship, which wasn't depicted as being super robust in previous literature. And Iban have been studied quite extensively, so there's a lot of literature to pick from. But there wasn't a whole lot about ancestors per se. Some researchers, in their defense, did acknowledge ancestor worship being a part of Iban religion, but it was usually kind of downplayed and kind of a side note. So I'm going to describe why I think Iban actually have a robust system of ancestor worship, and that the traditional religion is centered on ancestors. So part of which, to begin, is this idea of the Narong, which is usually translated as a secret helper. Long story short, it usually takes the form of the natural environment, like an animal or a feature like a river or a mountain or something like that. And these are kind of spirits that are said to kind of guide each individual. Each individual will have their own secret helper, which again would be claimed to manifest as a different kind of animal or a different feature of the environment. And if you have a secret helper, for example, that's a gibbons, then that person cannot eat a gibbons because they'd be eating their secret helper. So it actually has behavioral consequences. With that said, as this quote suggests, right, the Narong seems to be usually the spirit ancestor or dead relative who becomes the special protector of some individual Iban. So again, I think this makes explicit connection to an ancestor spirit or dead relative. And thus, with this kind of broader approach to ancestor worship, the broader definition that I use, you can say that Narong is a form of ancestor worship, given that this is part of the supernatural claims that the Iban make. So this is a form of ancestor worship, even if it wasn't previously thought to be so. So I'll give you another example, if that wasn't good enough. The Orang Panga are another set of supernatural deities in the Iban pantheon. So they're typically described as these kind of mythic heroes or culture heroes, right? A lot of their mythology, the big mythological stories, were centered on the Orang Panga, right? They were the main characters in those mythological stories. However, while they're usually depicted as gods, sometimes people will link them to ancestors. It's made pretty explicit by Iban themselves and in the anthropological literature that the Orang Pangao sit atop the genealogical pedigrees that these Iban recite. And I'll get to this a little bit more about these recitations here in a second. But long story short, they actually make an explicit connection and would claim that the Orang Pangao are actually their distant ancestors, right? Kind of original Iban, if you will. And that's why they're kind of these main characters in their kind of creation stories and whatnot. So with that explicit connection to the pedigrees that the Iban make, I would argue that it's also a form of ancestor worship with that broad enough approach. And if that wasn't enough, there's the Batara. This is usually the most explicit connection to ancestor worship if there is one in the literature. So sometimes translated as gods, but these are the spirits that are usually invoked during the kind of rice rituals. They're the ones that are usually invited, again, to participate and bless the rice fields and things like that. So again, more explicitly linked to being dead relatives. And lastly, to give one more example, Antu are typically translated as spirits, or sometimes even like ghosts, usually to kind of reflect a negative connotation that Iban have towards them. So they're more or less the kind of opposite of the Batara, which are usually benevolent spirits. Antu usually have more of a negative connotation, seen as causing mischief and otherwise being benevolent spirits, kind of broadly speaking. However, again, as I pull another quote from the literature, right, Wadley, who studied in the same longhouse, I kind of inherited his longhouse, by the way, makes the case of Antu being ancestors more directly by stating that dead are generally referred to as Antu, right? So it's the deceased are generally referred to as Antu. Eventually, they may kind of become Batara as they're kind of more worshipped, but the dead generally, as a general category, are referred to as Antu. And that's part of the reason they sometimes translated as ghost. So here's kind of a table summary from this publication, pulled right out of the literature, that despite the fact that the Iban themselves will use different labels, and despite the fact that ethnographers typically translate these labels differently, I argue that they're basically all different forms of ancestors, right? They all have explicit connections to actually being ancestors if you take a broad enough approach to ancestor worship. And I point out that I don't think this is limited to Iban. I think cross-culturally, like Victor Turner, for example, from Ndembu in Central Africa, he used the word shades as a translation for the kind of Ndembu ancestors, which obscures the fact that they were actually ancestors for Ndembu. So again, that kind of obscures it in the literature. Napoleon Chagnon talked about Yanomamo religion being centered on the Hekara, or being shamanistic. But the Yanomamo themselves, much like the Orang Tangga of the Iban, will claim that the Hekara are kind of the original Yanomamo, and all Yanomamo are descendants of the Hekara spirits. Therefore, I would say that that's also a form of ancestor worship. So with this kind of broad approach, ancestor worship becomes much more prevalent. And again, this realization not only drove this analysis, but also drove my interest in explaining why are ancestors so important cross-culturally. So let's talk about why they're so important cross-culturally, with explicit examples from Iban of Indonesia. So I'll bring back this definition that I'm using just as a reference. So I argue that ancestor worship is important. And it's important to take this kind of broader approach to ancestor worship because it's kind of a meta-tradition. Like archaeologist Todd Van Poel would call it a meta-tradition. It combines two other traditions, and they'll manifest in different ways cross-culturally, but it essentially combines a mechanism of kin recognition, recognizing your kin in the environment beyond kind of immediate family members, and then kin prosociality. So recognizing your kin isn't really that important from an evolutionary perspective in and of itself. It's how you behave towards those kin once you have that kin recognition system in place. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So humans have extensive forms of kin recognition, right? We have clan names, we have totem names, our last names traditionally follow kind of patrilineal descent in kind of Western society, right? These are all identifiers to be able to identify our kin in the environment, right? Even very distant kin, who we may not actually know the genealogical connections to. So for example, back when Caitlin Clark was kind of big at the University of Iowa, I suppose she's still big here. With the Indiana fever, my dad used to brag about, oh yeah, she's kin, right? She's Caitlin Clark, she's a Clark. So she was kind of making that connection explicit, or he was making that connection explicit, right? So again, we use these identifiers. In small-scale societies, they would be used in much the same way, right? So whether it's totems, typical of Australia, or clan names of Melanesia, things like that. And finally, marriage also more or less doubles the size of your kin because you can recognize kin on your father's side. Usually, it's kind of baked in that you'll recognize your mother and through association, her kin. Humans, because we have culturally sanctioned marriage practices, we kind of add on the father side as well, right? We have these sanctioned unions, and therefore our father's our kin, and now we have all his recognized kin as our kin as well. So these two systems kind of broaden the overall kin recognition abilities of humans. And then kin prosociality, again, to reiterate, because I think it's important, recognizing your kin is evolutionarily unimportant in and of itself, unless you have a mechanism for behaving towards those kin in specific ways. So in this case, treatment of kin, right? Most cultures have prescriptions for how you're supposed to treat your family members, even very distant ones. So I think that that's very important and kind of baked into ancestor worship, right? If you recognize a common ancestor, you worship a common ancestor, then you're going to be more likely to not only recognize those kin, recognize more kin, you're going to feel more obligated to behave in a cooperative and altruistic manner towards those kin, which again, ancestor worship is that system that I think crucial for linking these two things. And I'll get to kin selection here in a second, but it's essentially a theory in evolutionary biology that explains human altruism, which is making a sacrifice, a reproductive cost for one individual in order to benefit to produce a reproductive benefit in another individual from an evolutionary biological perspective. And they also argue that the system of kin prosociality, again, usually manifests in the idea that you'll be punished either supernaturally or by your kinsmen for treating your kinsmen in inappropriate ways, right? Berating them, things like that. You also potentially reward, either supernatural reward or again, reward from your kinsmen for treating your kinsmen with grace and altruism. All right, so I told you I'd double back to this because it's going to be important for the next study as well. So I want to talk about inclusive fitness, otherwise known as kin selection, which is a measure of an individual's overall reproductive success, not just the reproductive success of themselves per se, but of their kinsmen as well. Right, so it's kind of this combined measure of, if I don't reproduce, but I help my sister reproduce, the odds of her offspring sharing some of my genetics still helps my reproductive success overall. So it's kind of a combined measure of, again, my reproductive success along with those of my kinsmen, particularly close kinsmen, because genealogical relatedness drops off fairly quickly. We'll get to that here in a second. But this is Hamilton's rule, which essentially describes why altruism could evolve in populations of organisms, even though natural selection should favor all organisms to behave selfishly, so to speak. But it essentially argues that the benefits of a particular behavior, an altruistic behavior, should be greater than the cost of that action, weighted by the relatedness between individuals within that action. Right, so essentially, the more related you are, the less the benefit has to be in order to outweigh any cost associated with a particular altruistic behavior. So for example, if the cost is like dying for your second cousin, the relatedness is probably not going to be strong enough for that benefit to outweigh that cost, for example. It's a pretty heavy cost. So it's kind of a ratio of understanding altruistic behavior, not only in humans, but in all organisms. Again, this is kind of an idea rooted in evolutionary biology, which has been applied to humans, typically in human behavioral ecological studies. All right, so let's talk about how this could evolve in the human population. So for example, we have an apical ancestor A here, and we have descendants B and C. Again, I forgot exactly what they are. They're probably like second cousins or something like that. So the question then becomes, why would C act altruistically towards B, right? They're not going to share a lot of genetic relatedness. Therefore, natural selection would be unlikely to favor any kind of kin selection for individual C acting altruistically towards individual B, unless the cost was really small. But I argue that if ancestor begins an altruistic behavior, right, acts altruistically towards other individuals in their society, they pass down that, and then it becomes a traditional behavior of altruism. So once it becomes traditional, it becomes passed down to its offspring through the generations, right, offspring and eventually further down descendants. So if you have a behavior something like, right, this ancestor is telling its offspring, treat all of my offspring as you would treat yourself. In other words, put it in kind of a biological perspective, treat them as if you're 100% related, as if your genetics are 100% overlap. So if that tradition takes hold and is passed down through the generations, then that tradition of treat all of my descendants as you would treat yourself could reach this generation, thus improving the chances that individual C will behave altruistically towards individual B. So the role of traditions is really kind of taking on this evolutionary implications in this case. All right, so how does this manifest, again, cross-culturally, not even within the Iban per se? But I have a few quotes here pulled from the literature that I think kind of demonstrate how these kind of traditions get passed on and take root culturally in these societies. So as Victor Turner describes for Yandembu, disapproved conduct may mean causing a quarrel in the kin group, going away from the dead person's village to live elsewhere, or disobeying a wish expressed in his or her lifetime, that of being the ancestor's lifetime. So again, there's clearly this idea that's kind of taken root in the Yandembu culture. That you have to behave in the ways the ancestors want you to, even after they're passed, right? Even after they're dead. And then another example, also from Africa, is we don't see the Gongwasi, which are the ancestors, but we know that they expect certain behaviors of us. We must eat so and act so. When you are quarrelsome and unpleasant to other people, usually kinsmen, and people are angry with you, the Gungwasi see this and come to kill you. The Gungwasi can judge who is right and who is wrong. So again, this idea of ancestor worship, again, kind of combining kin recognition with these traditions of pro-sociality, right? Treat kinsmen as if like you would treat yourself. All right, so for the Iban example, this usually takes the form of combining these two other traditions. That of adapt, which is kind of customary laws, it's typically translated, but it's essentially how Iban are expected to behave towards each other, right? And this promotes pro-sociality. Once you know someone's a kinsman, you are supposed to act kindly towards them, shelter them, share food with them, things like that. And then two sut, as I mentioned, kind of genealogical recitations. So from the literature, I read this before I went to the field. The idea was that they have these two sut. Iban individuals will kind of meet each other in what's called beta sut, which I'll get a quote here in a second, which is essentially go through the generations, right, list their ancestors until they find a common ancestor, and then they recognize each other as kin and can behave appropriately towards each other, right? They kind of have this built-in tradition of being able to recognize kin fairly quickly. And sometimes this could be up to 30 generations. I didn't experience anything close to this. I mean, for me, it was more like 4 or 5 generations at the most, which is fairly typical of even Western societies, if that. So I read about this and I thought, oh man, this would be really a cool place to study ancestor worship. And I was kind of thinking about these ideas of kin pro-sociality and kin recognition. If you can recite it for 30 generations, you can find a lot of kinsmen in your environment, right? That's an ancestor way far away in genealogical time. So again, I think to bring up another quote, this kind of summarizes my point exactly. So traveling on the Muka River, which the anthropologist Vincent Setliff was, with a young Iban man, we entered 18 different longhouses. He had never been on that river or the longhouses where we stayed, so my companion and a member of the host community tied up the fishnet, or genealogized, beta sut for what Iban would call it. So with amazing frequency, the participants discovered some ancestral tie within 5 generations, either between themselves or between my friend and an acquaintance of the host. Right, so again, there's kind of this baked-in system where they can quickly find a common ancestor and thus treat that person as a kinsman. So again, the big point, as I'm kind of harping on here, but it's important, is that ancestor worship is really the key mechanism that kind of combines these systems of kin recognition with kin pro-sociality. So you may be asking, right, other systems theoretically could combine kin recognition and kin pro-sociality. So why make it religious? Why bake it into ancestor worship? Now I've got a few answers to that. Now, first off, people can refrain from displaying behaviors that they are trying to discourage. Right? An example might be, like, again, berating someone for berating somebody else. Right? Hey, you're not supposed to berate that person when you're doing it yourselves. You can kind of put that on the ancestors. The ancestors don't want you to berate that person. And similarly, kind of along similar lines, it's indirect criticism of others. I'm not criticizing your behavior. The ancestors just don't want you to behave that way, so you should stop what you're doing. So it kind of has this almost punishment, enforcement, social enforcement, I guess, more broadly, kind of baked into this idea, because it's the ancestor claims that are important, right? It's about dead ancestors specifically, which is a supernatural claim and thus a religious claim, rather than the ancestor as in grandma wants you to stop doing this. And finally, I think, and probably most importantly, making it religious means you can't verify it, right? By saying that ancestors don't want you to behave that way, you can't go ask them like you could a living ancestor, right? Grandma doesn't want you to behave that way, well, I'm gonna go find out, I'm gonna go ask her, right? By making it a dead ancestor, that claim is no longer verifiable, right? So therefore, it kind of takes on this approach of you can rebut the person who's telling you not to behave this way. That's inherently kind of antisocial way of doing it, but by saying, right? Because it's a dead ancestor doing it, there is that unverifiability, unfalsifiability to it, which I think is a kind of a critical idea of why ancestor worship specifically links, it's particularly well suited to link kin recognition and kin pro-sociality through the generations, to kind of keep it going generation after generation. All right, finally, we've made it to the last section here. I'm almost getting there. So I've talked about ancestors being more widespread, not only with Iban, but also cross-culturally. I've talked about why I think that's important for studying ancestor worship in terms of linking kin recognition and kin pro-sociality. But how about actually studying the specific influence on ancestors, and can you even measure that? I sought to find out. So you tell me if I succeeded or not. So I told you to remember this quote from earlier, because it's going to be crucial to this last study I did, or part of the study I did. So thinking about parent-offspring conflict, right, where parents are expected to mold an offspring against its better interests. So inherent in this quote is the idea that parents mold an offspring, right? They're manipulating their offspring. So that's parental manipulation in kind of evolutionary biological terms. If that becomes traditional, right, if parents are continuing to manipulate their offspring, then something interesting happens. You could actually think about this as ancestors would be expected to then mold descendants against their better interests. So ancestors are manipulating their descendants' behavior even after they're dead. That's where I think ancestor worship kind of comes back to. But we'll get to that here in a second. So again, once parent-offspring conflict becomes traditional, then you have ancestor-descendant conflict, or at least the potential for it. So here's kind of a cleaner version, right? Ancestors should then be expected to mold, to influence, to manipulate descendants against their better interests in serving the ancestors' interests, evolutionary interests. So, some anthropologists actually sought to model this behavior, right? Because humans are a cultural species. We can have traditional parental manipulation to an extent other organisms can't because of our extensive cultural behaviors. So, and again, I have to do this in every talk I give, right? But it's going to be some math. I know anthropology talks don't often have math per se, maybe some statistics, but in this lecture I got to have both. So I'm a quantitative evolutionary anthropologist, so this is the kind of stuff I like to do. So, borrowing the idea of parent-offspring conflict, Coe et al., in a really interesting paper, modeled the amount of altruism based on the success rates of parental manipulation in each generation, right, which is that N there, number of generations removed from a common ancestor, plus the relatedness, right, the genealogical relatedness or genetic relatedness, times, right, one being the constant, minus, again, success rate of parental manipulation. So a very simple equation. They argued you can actually model altruism as a result of parental manipulation kind of adding on to genetic relatedness. Some later models who kind of built off this original model call the success rate of parental manipulation a cultural coefficient of relatedness as opposed to a genealogical or genetic coefficient of relatedness to kind of map on how culture adds on to extra cooperation and altruism onto genetic relatedness. So that's another way of kind of thinking about this model. So this was the base model that I was interested in kind of thinking about as I was collecting my data. So to give you an example of this model, this again, it's kind of dense here, but bear with me. I want to give you an example of how you can actually plug these numbers in to get a measurement of altruism. Right, so consider that a parent attempts to manipulate their offspring to behave as if their full sibling, right, so that would be half related or 0.5, is just as valuable as themselves, that being changing the R from 0.5 to being equal to 1. Assume that the offspring accepts half of the parental manipulation, that is, the success rate of that manipulation would be 0.5. And imagine this pattern repeating for 3 generations, with every offspring accepting half of the parental influence in each generation, right? So in this case, it's a model, it's simple, we're being kind of constant here. Obviously, reality would be a bit different. So the amount of altruism predicted between second cousins who are only genetically related by 0.031 would be equal to 0.152. So hopefully it's become clear, right? If you plug these numbers in, that's when you get that 0.152. So you can expect 5 times the amount of altruism. This model predicts 5 times the amount of altruism if these numbers hold in a human society. Right? So it's essentially boosting the genetic relatedness, which is why it's sometimes called the cultural coefficient of relatedness, kind of adding on to what you would expect from kin selection or inclusive fitness. Would predict this much altruism, if you want to think about it that way. But you can boost it through a tradition of manipulation to be almost 5 times greater. Right? So this would explain why humans behave, like why are all you here despite the fact I'm not your kinsman, at least not that I know of. Right? Why are we so nice to our non-kinsmen? Part of it would be because we have these systems of being nice. Now, in a Western society, it's been taken to extremes where we behave with a lot of non-kinsmen every day. In small-scale societies, you wouldn't necessarily be behaving with non-kinsmen all the time. Right? Most people would probably have some genealogical relatedness to each other. So that's where this model was more to reflect a traditional society than Western society. What the societies that anthropologists have traditionally studied. So here's kind of a graphical for you visual learners. It's a graphical example. And again, the second cousins, right, in this case it would be G and J is how you read this graph. They share a common ancestor way back a few generations in A. So that's where that number comes from. That, what I call boosted relatedness instead of altruism is, again, I think a better way to think about it. What the model is actually saying. So the genealogical relatedness would be 0.031. But again, that boosted relatedness from parental manipulation being accepted or half successful can boost altruism between humans, in this case between second cousins, again, almost fivefold. So the consequences in evolutionary terms for human altruism will be quite extensive. All right, so here's a graph, and it's kind of, again, I hate this graph because it's not like a smooth graph that quantitative researchers like. But these are all the R coefficients, the genealogical relatedness or genetic relatedness that I had in my data set. So I plugged these in. So my goal, and part of this study, was to find out what is the success rate of parental manipulation and ancestral manipulation if it becomes generational. So I wanted to find out, for Iban cooperation, where do they fall in this line, right? It's probably not going to be 100% successful in every generation. So I set out to study which line would be most accurate for my data. So essentially, again, you have relatedness here. It only can go up to half related in full siblings and or parents and offspring. And then again, what I call boosted relatedness. If it's 100% successful, that means they're behaving, treating others exactly like they would treat themselves. Right? They're essentially, there's no genetic differences. And then keep in mind that if I were to continue this graph, a zero, kind of a baseline would be inclusive fitness, right? They're altruism expected based on genetic relatedness by itself. So this is essentially getting, these numbers are, to what extent are ancestors boosting altruism in a human society? So, in order to operationalize this model, I'm going to walk you through again how exactly I collected data. This is what evolutionary anthropologists do. Right? We take quantitative models, we operationalize them, collect data, run some stats, and see what we get. So here's the focal model, bringing it back. So, as a measure of altruism, which is hard to actually quantify in the field, so as a proxy, I use cooperation, which is much easier to see who's cooperating with who. Right? Whether in their rice fields, who's helping who harvest, who's helping who plant, who gives who food, things like that. So I studied cooperative interactions. What I did was I did some focal follows every day where I would watch individuals, go to their rice fields again, typically that's where they would spend most of their days. And I would note who they interacted with, right? Sometimes they'd have people come with them. It's usually family members, but sometimes others. And then I would note how long they were doing it. And I would note, so who was doing it, who was present, how long they did it. And then when I got home, I would interview everybody else in the household. I would go to each household, and I would interview everyone in that household, and I would ask them the same things. What did you do today for work? How long did you do it? And who did you work with? So from that, I was able to kind of create a data set which split all those work parties into dyads. I can see who helped who most often, so I can have this measure of cooperative interactions as a measure of altruism. That was what I was trying to measure with this. So I did some genealogies, which is pretty standard in anthropological practice. Did some genealogy work. Interviewed people, asked them who their relatives are, right? Kind of had a standardized approach to it. Who's your mother? Who's your father? Who are your siblings, et cetera, et cetera. Who else in the longhouse can you name that's a kinsman? What's your relationship to them? So I did these extensive genealogies. They weren't as extensive as I thought, which is kind of a limitation to the study. Genealogical depth was lacking, which limited my stats power. But alas, I got the result anyway that seemed to work. And then finally, again, to reiterate, this was the parameter that I was trying to estimate from the data. So that's all I needed was cooperative interaction. I guess I have to summarize here. All I needed was cooperative interactions as a measure of altruism, relatedness as my R measure, and then using that data to try to estimate how successful parental, and again, I argue ancestral manipulation was in this population from this data. So let the data speak for itself. I used a nonlinear model. And this was the result. Oh, you can't really see it down here. This is actually the success rate from the model. Ended up being 0.28. So if I were to go all the way back here real quick, not a ton of influence, not as much as I expected, but it would be just under the line 3 here. Right, so again, I was trying to see where my data would fit on that, how successful parents were being. And the result was about 0.28. But I will point out it's a pretty large credible interval. I did a Bayesian stat, so I used credible interval. Long story short, huge interval because it was kind of an underpowered study, to be honest. I didn't have a ton of genealogical depth, which limited the extent of my power for the statistics. And then I'll point out this line is also, this is kin selection, right? Essentially, if individuals are behaving only from their genetic relatedness, that's why it's a nice smooth line, so that's the baseline. So I was able to predict some what I would consider ancestor influence in my data based on the cooperative interactions that I saw to collect the data on. So I thought this was pretty interesting, and so did human nature. All right, I showed you this picture earlier in one of my slides. They thought it was a unique study, right? And I don't think anyone else has done anything similar. I actually measure ancestor influence or the influence of traditions on human behavior in this kind of quantitative way, systematic quantitative way. So they reached out to me after after it got through peer review and was going to get published, and putting my study on the cover as being the kind of cover story for the issue. So, humble brag, I made the cover of Human Nature. Right, so again, it was a unique enough study that they, even though it was underpowered a bit, for that part of it at least, the other part was a little bit better. But I'm not going to talk about that in this lecture because I've already talked enough. So thank you for your time.